everyone. I am Abraham Ames. I work for the Orleans County Conservation District, and we are managing a lake and watershed action plan for Willoughby Lake in Westmore, Vermont. Now, even if you're not a local, you might be aware that Willoughby Lake has exceptionally clean water, some of the best in the state. Unfortunately, the lake is experiencing an upward phosphorus trend, which eventually will change the nature of the lake and lower its water quality. So the time to act is now to preserve the water quality. DEC made this decision and selected the lake to fund a lake and watershed action plan. As I said, the Orleans County Conservation District is managing that, and we are fortunate to have been able to have partnered with the Memphremagog Watershed Association. Patrick Hurley will be conducting our environmental assessments and will be taking us through the current conditions of the lake, and will be outlining our work that we have going forward with the Lake and Watershed Action Plan. So, Patrick, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abe. I'm going to share my screen here and introduce myself. So I am a project manager for the Memphremagog Watershed Association, and our mission is to protect and preserve the natural beauty and ecosystems of the Memphremagog Watershed, within which Willoughby Lake sits. Actually, it's at the top of our watershed, and we're very fortunate and privileged to be able to provide, assistance on this important work to maintain the exceptional water quality and aesthetic that is the Willoughby watershed. So tonight I'm focusing mostly on the known existing conditions of the watershed and the lake itself. So with watershed action plans, we want to take kind of a holistic approach to understanding where these positive phosphorus trends are coming from and where these potential phosphorus sources might lie and reside within the watershed. So we take an approach that starts from kind of a bird's eye view, get a lay of the land. We also consider water quality monitoring data, land use and land change patterns, and things like infrastructure, roads, stormwater, drainage infrastructure that might accelerate or implicate further areas of water quality concern or degradation. So we're going to be talking about both the physical characteristics of the watershed and the lake, and also the biological and natural communities that sit within the watershed and provide co-benefits and ecosystem functions that are necessary to maintain a healthy ecosystem within the basin. So, a little speed dating facts about Lake Willoughby. It's a relatively small watershed considering the size of its lake. There's about 11,500 acres of upland that drain to the lake, and the lake is 1,700 acres. So, a very large body of water and a moderately sized watershed for Vermont. It's very deep, however, so 320 feet in its maximum depth. That results in this very large volume of water. And so while we don't have any major tributaries coming into the lake, other than some of the small brooks that you cross along Route 5 and along Long Pond Road, that small trickle of water entering this large volume of water results in this very extensive residence time, we call it. So there's on average 9 years between water entering at the south end of the lake and flowing out at the north end of the lake. So the water that we have in the lake, it resides there for quite a long time. And so we can't change how long that water is there, or how we can't refresh that water once it's in the lake, but we can control the quality of the water that's coming off the mountains entering into the lake. And that has strong implications for water quality, for phosphorus pollution, for cyanobacteria blooms or invasive species, and also the aesthetic properties that we come to love in Willoughby Lake. And so the whole action plan is devised to address nutrient trends, invasive species, shoreline habitat, and the infrastructure and developed lands that surround our water bodies. The state produces these lake scorecards for each major lake and pond in Vermont. And as you can see in here, we have some data for Willoughby. Primarily what we look at are the 4 areas of concern that are most easily monitored in water quality. So we have their spring total phosphorus, dating back all the way to 1979. We also have summer total phosphorus. We have summer Secchi disk, which is a measurement of water clarity. And we have summer chlorophyll A, which is a measurement of algae growth. And as you can see, the only panel that has red is the spring total phosphorus annual means. And that indicates that since 1979, since data has been collected, we've seen this positive trend, this increase in mean phosphorus concentrations in the springtime. And that is detrimental to water quality. As an oligotrophic lake, Lake Willoughby should be at 14 parts per billion phosphorus or lower. And currently we're measuring greater than that for our B2 water quality classifications. Our A1 water quality classifications actually dictate lower levels than even 14. So we try to strive to meet those standards that are set by the state. We also have spring total phosphorus increases over the past, a shorter time frame that indicate a rapid increase in phosphorus concentrations in the last 20 years when we take out the consideration of data from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that increase has really been happening in the last 2 decades. There's also been monitoring performed by volunteers of the Westmore Association on 6 tributaries to the lake. And so we monitor the outlets of these tributaries to try to get an understanding of the water quality conditions that are feeding into the lake. And this represents the land use and land development patterns that are upstream of those monitoring sites. And so there are 43.3 miles of mapped perennial streams in the Willoughby watershed. There are a lot more miles of intermittent, or what we call ephemeral streams, that don't always flow. But for monitoring purposes and the proportion of water inputs to the lake, these 6 tributaries represent the majority of our watershed drainage area. And we've noticed that there are some elevated levels of both chloride and total phosphorus. As you can see, chloride has a maximum concentration of 101 at the south end of the lake. And while that may seem high, these are milligrams per liter, and the state sets water quality standards at 239 milligrams per liter. So we're well below the water quality standards, that we don't face those challenges that often people hear about with chloride in the western part of the states and the Champlain Basin. That said, we do see really high phosphorus concentrations coming from some of these tributaries. In particular, the highest measurement, 255 parts per billion, we're taking at what locals call Roaring Brook. And this is an order of magnitude higher than what we would hope to see coming out of some of these tributaries feeding into the lake. So the water quality data really allows us to kind of pinpoint what subcatchments within the watershed might be contributing greater proportion of phosphorus loads at different times of the year. And now this is only summer data, and so we're not necessarily capturing that spring runoff event where the roads are shedding a lot of water and road sand and silt, and fields don't have much vegetation on them to retain that runoff. And so, we can expect quite variable concentrations from all these tributaries across years and weeks and seasons, but it does give us some evidence to pinpoint some more efforts for follow-up field assessments. When you zoom out and look at the whole watershed and how the ground essentially is covered, we're very fortunate. We have nearly 86% of our watershed in the Willoughby Lake drainage is forested, and that's vastly dominated by deciduous forests. When we look at our impervious surfaces, those surfaces that don't allow rain or precipitation to infiltrate and percolate into the ground, we see that it really only represents about 2% of the lake or the watershed surface area. And so there's not a lot of development in Lake Willoughby watershed, and that allows us to maintain this high quality water and exceptional water use year after year. And we also have 5% of our coverage is wetland. So there's lots of intact habitat that can protect our watershed from erosion and sediment and runoff from developed areas. When you zoom a little bit closer and you're only considering the 100-foot buffer around the lake, these numbers change quite a bit. Now we're only at 56% forested cover, meaning that we have less trees on our shorelines than we do everywhere else in the watershed. We have only 3% of wetlands, which is almost half of what we had in the greater watershed as a whole. There's no agriculture in this portion of the watershed. But when you look at our impervious surfaces, they've nearly gone up tenfold. We're almost approaching 20% impervious surface. So that's an important component of our watershed health and our lake water quality. The shoreline is an interface between the water and the land. And if we have too much concentrated development along the shoreline, we don't have stable shoreline areas. They're prone to erosion. We have faster runoff from driveways, rooftops, and paved areas. We have less habitat for the critters, less connectivity between upland and lowland habitats. And so we really want to, zoom into this area and see where can we make improvements along the lake periphery that will provide, an improvement in the quality of that interface between the lake and the uplands. For a small watershed, it does have a fair amount of roads. There are over almost 40 miles of roads in the Willoughby Lake Watershed. The vast majority of those are owned by the town. 57% are owned by the town, and that's what you can see in that mustard yellow. There's also a major state highway running along the east side of the lake, and there's a mix of private roads. Quarter of the road networks in the watershed are actually private, and so we don't have any data about the condition of these roads or their likeliness to erode or contribute sediment loads to the lake. And so we need to consider roads when we're looking at the watershed as a whole, and also when we're zooming into that shoreland area, because roads are those impervious surfaces that very quickly shed runoff when it rains or when snow is melting. They collect a lot of road grit, sand, salt, oil and grease from cars. Fertilizers come off of driveways and come off of lawns and run down roads into the drainage ditches. And so we need to take a good look at our roads, and based on the ownership and opportunities for water quality improvement projects, start chipping away at problematic areas or areas that are prone to contribute sediment into a road, based on the way water moves across the landscape. In, I believe, 2018, the Orleans Conservation District and the town of Westmore performed road erosion inventories across all of the public roadways in the watershed. And they essentially score them based on whether or not they're hydrologically connected. So there's water that lands on the road, does it run off into either a wetland or a stream? Those are hydrologically connected. And those are the colored segments that you see on this map. The black segments are not hydrologically connected, so they should not be prone to excess runoff or erosion or sediment contributions. But those colored segments, those are the ones that we evaluate, or that the Orleans Conservation District evaluated for their risk of erosion. The green segments fully meet the permit requirements stated in the municipal roads general permits for the town of Westmore. The yellow segments are incomplete data, so they haven't been fully assessed. The orange partially meet the permit requirements, and so there's room for improvement. And the red segments are non-compliant, so there's quite a need for improving those roads and employing best management practices to manage the runoff and the sediment that might be derived from. And as you can take a glimpse of the map, there are a few areas where these road segments are concentrated. We actually see them in the upper tributaries, in the headwaters, where it's often steeper, where the roads might be older or less wide and less well built, where we have higher chance of undersized culverts and a lot more driveways. And so we like to take a look from the top of the watershed down and address how water is moving across the landscape, how our roads are impacting that and affecting that, and how we can better manage runoff from the roads, protect the lake's water quality. Along these roads are a lot of culverts. There are over 200 culverts that have been inventoried by the State Agency of Transportation, and they're scored along a general spectrum of scores, where you have good, you have excellent in blue or green, you have fair in yellow, orange, or poor, red, or critical, and there's actually one urgent out there that imminently need to be addressed. Now, these data are a handful of years old, and the town of Westmore road association or roads department have been working, since the road erosion inventories to address those priority segments. And culverts are often part of those priority segments. And so what we would propose to do is, reevaluate where some of these culverts are on the landscape and how they affect the movement of water, the movement of sediment, and potential phosphorus loading to the lake, and whether there's room for retrofit or opportunity for replacement. These culverts, of the 200 culverts, 31 were assessed for their geomorphic compatibility. Now, this is a determination of whether the culvert or crossing is suitable for the size of the channel that's passing through it. And we have a mixed score on some of these. There's one of them that are compatible, fully compatible in the watershed. The rest are either mostly or partially incompatible. We have fully incompatible culvert at one site on Long Pond Road. And so the reason that we look into these data is, geomorphically speaking, is this crossing a problem? Is it undersized? Is it prone to clogging? Is it prone to blowouts? Is it prone to failure? We'd like to address that before an event happens so that we can mitigate the potential for, larger scale erosion events and larger scale washouts. We'd like to get our eyes on these culverts before those events happen so that we can start planning for their repair, their retrofit, or their replacement. And these are also dominated, or the incompatible crossings are concentrated on Stony Brook, Roaring Brook, and Mill Brook. And so we're going to propose to take a peek at some of these culverts while we're doing our road assessments. Alongside these geomorphic compatibility assessments were aquatic organism passage assessments. So these determined whether aquatic organisms like fish, amphibians, reptiles can make their way upstream through these crossings, or whether they're impeded by these crossings. Now, what often stops passage is a perched culvert where it's a foot or so higher than the water surface on the downstream end. So if there's a step between the pool and the bottom of the culvert, many species can't get up and over that. And so that prevents their upriver movements. And as we know, fish need upriver tributary spawning and nursery grounds to maintain healthy populations. And so when we look at our map culverts and how they score on the aquatic organism passage, it's not very good. It's outright a little bit bleak. There's no aquatic organism passage on almost half of actually more than half of the culverts in the watershed. Reduced passage on another third of the culverts, and only full passage on one of the culverts. So if we're thinking about the fisheries and the populations in the lake, and we want to manage for healthy, robust, self-sustaining fish populations, we should really be considering making sure passage is available for these species to get up into their headwater habitats. And so these will also be evaluated briefly during our road erosion assessments and our culvert assessments to identify projects that may have a sediment reduction potential as well as habitat improvement potential. Another data set we looked at were the potentially erosive features. Now these are derived from high resolution LiDAR data, and it essentially uses slope, soil erodibility, proximity to streams, and a few other parameters to identify where erosive features might be on the landscape. And when you look at the whole Willoughby area, you see there's quite a lot of red, and most of these can be ignored because, as we know, the Willoughby watershed is pretty high gradient and high relief naturally, just through the geology. And so a lot of the red areas on the east and west shores of the lake are actually natural gullies and natural ravines that are formed from the mountains. There's also a handful of areas that may be mischaracterized as ditches or as driveway regrading. And so when we pull out some of those points that don't really speak to us or don't show a major potential sediment contribution source, what we're left with are areas that look to be historic logging roads or historic skid paths, old ditches that dump into tributaries that may be down cutting and eroding right at the mouth of the ditch, or other areas where there's been channelization in streams that might indicate a departure from how the stream would naturally function. So as we go through the process of our assessments for our roads, streams, and lake shorelines, we will keep an eye out for some of these erosive features, and in some of these larger upland properties where there was a history of logging or agriculture, we'll take a closer look at some of the potentially erosive features on the map to see if they result in real erosive features on the landscape. So there have been at least 5 years of Eurasian milfoil control in Lake Willoughby, and Eurasian milfoil is an invasive aquatic plant species. And there have been 4 to 6 target areas for treatment over the past 5 years of work. And overall, the contractor who performs this work says Willoughby Lake is looking good. It's got a trend towards control of these populations, but they encourage continued monitoring, continued harvest, diver assisted harvest to pull those weeds out, remove that propagation source, and work to improve the aesthetics and the lake shoreline habitat back to its natural state. And any of these projects that we try to assess, identify, and develop as water quality and phosphorus reduction projects should, in theory, have benefits towards aquatic invasive species, in the sense that their plants, by reducing the phosphorus loading to the lake, there's less nutrients available for those plants to have these large blooms or these large populations. And so while these water quality projects may not directly address the invasive species populations, they are working to reduce the ability for those populations to be so prolific. I mentioned fisheries when speaking about the passage or passability of the stream crossings, and when speaking to the district fish biologist, I was told that the priority in the Willoughby watershed are salmonids, and that can include both Atlantic salmon, landlocked, that are stocked in the lake, and that can also include many of the trout species that we see in the lake. The rainbow trout species are self-sustaining populations in the Willoughby watershed. Their abundance has been fluctuating. It may be low in the past few years than it has been in the past 20. And perhaps that may be related to a lack of headwater habitat or access to those headwater habitats. Lake trout are also self-sustaining. The abundance is very high. And when you talk about the size structures, that's kind of the population, whether they're young of the year and juveniles or fully mature adults. Apparently the size structure in Willoughby is one of the best in Northeast Vermont, so you can take pride in that. Rainbow smelt is one of the most important forage species for lake trout, rainbow trout, and salmon, and they have a high abundance in the lake. And they are, small trout-like fish that may not be a game species, but it is an important keystone in maintaining these healthy trout populations. And so monitoring the rainbow smelt populations gives us a sense of the resiliency of the trout populations. There's also a few other interesting species of note. One is burbo, yellow perch, which is an important game fish, minnows, white suckers, and Willoughby is home to the only round whitefish population in the state. So it's another thing that you can write home about. We have this relatively intact, strong, robust native fish population. There are no bass present in Willoughby Lake, and the intent is to keep it that way. Bass are ferocious predators and compete readily with salmonids for prey, and so they are competitive, and they may have a competitive advantage, under the changes in climate or precipitation patterns. So we do want to make sure that bass are not introduced to the Willoughby watershed. There are a handful of rare, threatened, and common species in the Willoughby watershed, none of which I can divulge the specific information or concern about both the integrity and the protection of the species. There's concerns of rare species black market trading, that as a agreement with the state, we can't divulge specific information, but do take pride in knowing that there are uncommon invertebrates, vertebrate animals, plants, vascular plants, scattered throughout all across the watershed, both in the lake, in the ponds upstream from the lake, and in the cliffs and forests that surround Westmore. And these critters are able to thrive here because of the real rich mixture in that natural communities. We have 10 significant natural communities in the watershed. My favorite being the dwarf shrub bog and the boreal, acidic, and calcareous cliffs. So there are important variabilities between slope, aspect, underlying geology, and hydrology that allow these communities to be positioned across the Willoughby watershed in a relatively small area, but across a big spectrum of conditions. And so we have anything from the classic northern hardwood forest of maples and birch and ash to some of the red spruce and northern forests. And a lot of these different communities are able to coexist in a relatively short distance from each other because of the large gradient in relief. We start at only a couple hundred feet or a couple thousand feet and go up to 2,500 by the time you're at Pisgah. So that provides changes in climate, changes in soils that allow for these different communities to develop. And so it's worth noting of these communities and of these rare, threatened, and uncommon species while we're looking for projects and while we're developing projects. One, so that we can be aware of their sensitivities and we can avoid any unnecessary impacts to those populations. And two, so that if there are opportunities to provide habitat benefits, we can get co-benefits aligned with water quality benefits, and that will score better when we essentially request grant funding to design and implement these projects. So important co-benefits to be kept in mind. So from this baseline kind of assessment, we then develop these proposed field assessments that really focus on lake shorelands and developed lands around the lake, private and public road screenings, tributary walks and stream bank assessments. And then we're also interested in taking peeks at the culverts and potentially erosive features while we're out and about looking for these different features across the landscape so that we can evaluate, are these contributing disproportionately high sediment or phosphorus loads? Are they preventing aquatic organism passage? Is it posing a flood or erosion risk to downstream or neighboring parcels? And all of these can be kind of teased into a matrix where we can evaluate their priority based on the cost to benefit ratio, the phosphorus reduction potential, the co-benefits that I mentioned, and the community desires and wishes. Some projects may score better, but the community wants to see another project in place first. And those are all considerations that we can take into the calculus that is project identification, prioritization, and development. So these are some maps of the proposed areas that we will assess. They're essentially taking out all the noise from those first few slides and highlighting the areas that we intend to focus our efforts and look for water quality challenges and opportunities. So these are the roads. These are the moderate to high risk high erosion risk roads. There are no private roads that are mapped because the state doesn't have data on them. So we are going to work with the Orleans Conservation District to identify which road associations and which private roads are eligible and interested in receiving these assessments. You also notice that a lot of these roads are concentrated in the upper tributary areas, and these are often because they're just gravel roads with steep slopes. So they're more prone to erosive erosion and degradation. Of the 43.3 miles of streams, we intend to walk about 15 of those miles. These are all of the streams that have demonstrated high phosphorus concentrations. These run through the most densely developed or densely agricultural parcels, and they often have a lot of energy coming screaming off the mountain. So we're gonna do some walks and we're gonna look for channel erosion, bank erosion, riparian buffers, and other indications of sediment or water quality opportunities that we can work with landowners to address. These maps highlight the potentially problematic culverts that we'd like to get our eyes on. There's an awful lot of them. We don't really feel like we'll have capacity to address every single one of them, but from these groupings, we'll select the highest priority culverts and work with our partners and private landowners to see how we can address the issues that they may demonstrate. When you pull out all the noise from those erosive features, what we found are there just seems to be some potential indications of erosion from the upland forest, which isn't really expected, but it's pretty typical. When we see old logging operations and old road cuts that haven't been maintained or have had, decades of regrowth on them, they can still fail. They can still act as, these large sediment contributors. And so, where possible, we're going to work with landowners to get on the ground and get our eyes out to these areas and look for gullies and look for washouts, or incising stream channels, where we might be able to do some work on the ground to arrest that erosion and mitigate that sediment. And then some of the most densely developed areas, both lake shoreland, residential, commercial, agricultural, or whatever it may be, we do hope to work with landowners to get on the ground and look for opportunities to do anything from managing ditches from farms to small stormwater treatment or green stormwater infrastructure practices on commercial or developed lands, or implementing lake-wise and lake shoreline restoration projects on the residential lots that are concentrated on the lake shore. And all of these areas are mostly focused on the northern half of the lake, and that's primarily based on the land use. We don't have any development on the southwest half or quarter of the lake, and very little on the southeast half. So the developed lands will be a major focus for the Orleans Conservation District, being the leaders in the lake-wise effort and having very close ties to the farming community in the area. And then, just so you're not, spinning with questions about how all this work is going to be funded, there are monies out there to do this work. And so this LWAP is essentially laying up the partners in the town to identify projects that are eligible for these specific grant programs. And we have anything from project development funding to design to implementation to long-term operations and maintenance. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are grant programs in Vermont that are specific to water quality, specific to natural resources or agricultural sectors or stormwater, that can be teased out through the development process, the project development process, to identify how are we going to pay for these projects. What angles do we have to work? What co-benefits do we need to capture to really be eligible and strong contenders for these grants? And this will allow partners to be able to continue this work even after the LWAP is complete, because there'll be money out there and opportunities out there for people to pick up a project and say, okay, we've identified it, we know the problem, let's go get development funding, let's work with landowners, let's get a design contractor, put together a plan, let's get it implemented with some contractors, and then we can provide operations and maintenance funding based on the different type of project and the needs of that project over the course of its lifespan. So all that is to say, we think we know a lot about the Willoughby watershed at the moment, but really this is just kind of the Spark Notes version. What we really need to do is get down on the ground, get on the lake, along the roads, and we need to start scoping out, screening, and identifying opportunities where we can mitigate runoff, mitigate sediment, reduce phosphorus load into the lake, and where we can work with the community to attain those goals, but also promote the beautification, promote the setting, and really build on the values that the community wants to see in the future that they envision for Westmore and Willoughby Lake. So with all that, we will be developing our actual field assessments over the next couple of weeks, getting into the field in the fall of 2022 and spring of 2023, and we'll regroup with the community, the town, public, and our partner organizations, DEC, Orleans County Conservation District, and Memphremagog Watershed Association, to really prioritize and identify which projects are we going to focus on now. So thank you very much for your time, and Abe, back to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Really appreciate that great rundown. Really looking forward to working with you on this project, and feel really grateful and privileged to have such a beautiful lake that we can focus our attention on. And I think the conservation effort here will bear real fruit. Glad to hear that we're not just looking at water quality, we're looking at the greater landscape. And I think this is going to have a lot of opportunities to really enhance the town in general and, conserve what is really excellent habitat and a beautiful landscape. So thank you very much. And to the greater community, please stay tuned. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to be involved. Otherwise, just pay attention. There will be more. Thank you, everyone. Take care.